Thank you for joining us in this panel, and welcome to this interactive session about scientific uncertainty, entitled "Communicating Uncertainty: A Challenge That Precedes COVID-19." Uncertainty is an inherent part of knowledge, and yet, in an era of contested expertise, many shy away from openly communicating their uncertainty about what they know, fearful of their audience's reaction. This is a quote from a paper that was published in May 2019. We think it is relevant to question and reflect upon the usefulness and importance of communicating scientific uncertainty, which has become a major topic with COVID, but has been very present before in topics such as climate change, and many others. We urge you to give us some examples from your own experience, like situations that you didn't know how to solve, or solutions that you have found, because this session is for you, and we hope we can make it as useful as possible for you. So just allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. So Tracey Brown, she runs Sense About Science, a charity which has turned the case for sound science and evidence into popular campaigns to urge scientific thinking among the public and the people who answer to them. Writer and editor, Tracey led research on reliability of evidence, including the 2009 peer review survey, the largest global survey of authors, reviewers, and editors. David Michaels is an epidemiologist and professor at the George Washington University School of Public Health. He was administrator of the US Occupational Safety and Health Administration from 2009 until 2017, the longest serving in OSHA's history. David leads efforts to protect the integrity of the science underpinning public health and environmental protections, and he's the author of books, such as Doubt is Their Product, and more recently, The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money, and the Science of Deception, as well as numerous articles in leading scientific magazines. Vera Novais graduated as a biologist at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, and she has worked as a researcher in environmental monitoring projects. Since 2006, she has worked as a science communicator and environmental educator. She completed a master in science communication, and since 2014, she has been working as a science journalist at Observador, general interest news media in Portugal. So, again, please do share your practices and concerns, comment on our speakers' remarks, and ask all the questions you want and need. For instance, if you do not agree with what is being said, let us know through the chat box. So no questions so far. So this is meant to be an interactive panel, and the speakers will answer your questions. Just to start the discussion rolling, I will ask one question to each speaker, and then we will move on from there. So Tracey, I would like to ask you, if you think that scientific uncertainty means that scientists are not certain about anything, and hence science journalists neither.
Okay, well, thank you, Rita, for that interesting introduction. I think it's interesting. We might laugh at that question, but very often that is the way that uncertainty is presented, to create that kind of a gap and an element of ridicule sometimes about those uncertain scientists. I hope that in some of those debates, such as climate that you mentioned, that we have matured as a society in our discussion of evidence and understanding the incremental nature of exploring new subjects. And certainly, I think in COVID discussions, there has been amazing restraint at not jumping for that kind of cheap shot against researchers. To say that you guys know nothing. There's been a very, very good shared understanding across policy, wider society, journalists, that we are trying to build in and understand an emerging picture. So I think we are mostly past that point. The thing I would just say is that when we talk about scientific uncertainty, broadly we seem to mean two different things. We mean a general observation that knowledge is tentative, knowledge is partial. And in this sense, I would advocate, in this for the first meaning of it, I would advocate that we stop using the phrase uncertainty, and in fact that we talk about how settled science is. And so if I could just give you an example of what I mean by that, I'm just going to share with you, if that's okay, I'm just going to show you briefly this little picture. So you can see what I mean by that. When we talk about the uncertainty, what we're often talking about is that some areas of knowledge are quite tentative and are emerging, and others are what we would call settled. And what's important about that is that our bar, I suppose, for new evidence is different. So if we were to have a real game-changing insight from a research paper, that we were wrong about the appearance of dinosaurs, we would expect the threshold of that evidence to be very high, to overturn such settled science and such a vast wealth of scholarship. On the other hand, the origin of consciousness is an area where people are constantly throwing in new bits of insight, and it's an emerging field. And therefore, I think we talk about a lot of information, a lot of research findings and insight there that we would expect to be overturned fairly rapidly. So that's the kind of thing I mean by the broad way in which we talk about scientific uncertainty. Then secondly, there's also the question of the estimation, a more precise calculation we're looking for, which is the estimation of confidence about the reliability of a particular bit of information or research results. And in that sense, there is a field of practice, and it's one that journalists really need to grasp so that they can understand the weight that they can put on a particular set of results. So I think that distinction is perhaps an important one for us to start with.
Sorry, looking for a microphone. Okay, thank you very much, Tracey. I would like to ask a question to David and then another to Vera, and then we can, of course, go on to other questions from the audience, namely, or come back to what Tracey just talked to us about. So, David. What I would like to know from you is when should journalists communicate uncertainty, doubt, and risk, and how should it be conveyed? And for Vera, I would like to ask her, as a journalist, how do you deal with scientific uncertainty? How do you decide when and how to communicate it? So David, if you please want to go first.
Okay. Good, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you, Rita. And actually, I think my answer really follows up very nicely on what Tracey was saying. I'm not going to discuss COVID-19 now. Perhaps we can come back to it, because I think that raises some really interesting issues around uncertainty and how we deal with it. But I think this idea about settled science is a really important one, and how settled, and it really has to do with the implications of the results and what we do with the information. So I'll speak primarily as a regulator. So, I ran the Occupational Safety and Health Administration under President Obama. I was also the regulator for the nuclear weapons complex under President Clinton. And so I was charged with protecting human health and the environment. And there's always uncertainty in these questions in science. you can't do human clinical trials on toxic chemicals or climate change. You can do animal studies, you can do different models, but you don't have certainty in the sense that people like to think about. But you have to protect the public. You've got to make decisions on the basis of the best available evidence. And the importance of that obviously is based on the, what the implications of your actions are. If it's not important, then you could wait for more certainty. But as we all understand for climate change, if you wait a long time, that has implications. And so you have to consider uncertainty. But when you think about uncertainty, there's real uncertainty. But in fact, what I've written a lot about is there's something I call manufactured uncertainty. That's what my books are about. When polluters or manufacturers of dangerous products, what they've learned is that if you can hire scientists to manufacture doubt, because that will confuse the public and could delay regulations for years or decades. We call it the tobacco playbook. And tobacco wasn't the first, but they certainly showed how to make that work, how to essentially confuse people and say there's so much uncertainty you can't do anything. But now there's a whole product defense industry, firms who specialize in producing reports that provide whatever conclusion their sponsor needs. And often that conclusion is the evidence is inconclusive. It's unsettled, there's too much uncertainty to move forward. Scientists are skilled at making this work look impressive. I'm an epidemiologist. I can look at epidemiologic studies or conclusions about them and see the holes, but I can't do that around weather forecasting or toxicology or things like that. And it's harder for you as a journalist to do that. And so I think what that means is we have to communicate risk and certainty and their relationship very differently than we do now. When risk is being identified and quantified, there's always some uncertainty. And I think as journalists, you could point that out. It's not a surprise. It doesn't mean that independent scientists disagree or that there isn't enough evidence to take the steps you need to take to save lives or to otherwise prevent a harm. You could say as a communicator that the evidence strongly points in a given direction, and while some may call for more research or say it isn't settled, it's also important to talk about the consequences of waiting. By not stepping in, by not doing something, you have exposure, you have increased risk. I also think it's important to identify how much of the uncertainty is being manufactured or magnified by mercenary scientists. And this is this sort of both-siderism problem, we sometimes call it. Journalists often feel that every story has two sides, you need to present both. And we've seen how that works for climate change. Scientific hacks, and these really are hacks, these are charlatans bankrolled by the fossil fuel industry, were given tremendous space in press reports by honest journalists who thought two sides should be communicated to assert their lies about climate change. So I think if you can't find an independent scientist not paid for by the industry who can defend a position, you don't have to just quote an industry hack. If you're writing about a report or study paid for by industry and you interview the scientist involved, I would say do some investigative reporting on that scientist, or if they work for a consulting firm, talk about them, and it's not just their position, but who they are. Did that person work for big tobacco? I mean, I find I often, when I'm looking at a scientist, I go back to the University of California, San Francisco, called the Tobacco Truth Library. And that has millions and millions of pages of tobacco documents. And I'll find a lot of scientists I'm dealing with now who did work for the tobacco industry, which of course says something about their integrity. How about the firm they work for? All these product defense firms, their business model is turning out studies that corporations need to keep doing what they're doing. Don't just say they work for the industry. If that's a firm, talk about the model of that firm, make a list of all the industries that firm works for and use that as identifying the person. I think that's very powerful. It's a different model. It's challenging to journalists to do that, but I think it's worth doing.
Okay, David, thank you very much. I will get back to you on that if no one from the audience does, and also on what Tracey said. But now I would like to hear from Vera.
So I hope, hello everyone, first of all, happy to be here with you. First of all, uncertainty is something that is related to science, and it must be. But uncertainty, it's not something that we like in the news. And we don't like it as journalists, and probably we don't like it also as readers or as the audience. So it's hard to have uncertainty in the newspapers. Also because we are not only dealing with science, us journalists, we are dealing with our editors. So even if you are a science journalist and you want to report it the best you can about science, you have to think also to whom you are working and who will read you. So, and these are the challenge, because it's not our job as science journalists to be cheerleaders for science. So science has to do that and scientists have to do that for themselves. We have to report the truth the best we can, but if there's uncertainty, of course, we have to put it forward. But we will not write about uncertainty. I say write because I'm a press journalist. We will not write in every topic. For example, we report about how will the weather be tomorrow, and we will not explain the uncertainty of meteorology every time we report about the weather. Of course, if we are reporting about other topics, let's say vaccines, will we have vaccines by the end of the year? Of course, I will reinforce all the uncertainties that there is along the way, what can go wrong and right, until we have vaccines. And it will all depend. Of course, it depends also if you can work with your editor to have this, or how much time you have to research and write about that topic, and also how much space you have to put it. So sometimes you don't have enough space and time to explain all the uncertainty related to that topic. So what can we do about this? It's really hard for science journalists, and I've seen some colleagues that are using social media just to explain what is behind their articles, and that is really interesting, and it is really engaging with the audience. And I will just take the chance to point out one of the things that we are always accused of. It's our titles, our hyped titles. Of course, we cannot lie. I'm totally, definitely, we cannot lie in our titles, but our titles are like hooks if we want to get people to watch our videos, to read our articles. If we have to put all the uncertainty in our title, no one will even care about reading it or watching it. And if we can take people inside our article or a piece of work, probably people will get some information about the uncertainty and the real stuff, because a title is too short and it is more like a hook. This is my opinion here.
Okay, so now this question is for our audience. I'd like to know if you agree with what Tracey said about uncertainty versus settlement, so to say. And also, what do you think about what David Michael said? And if you agree, at least the journalists, the science journalists in the audience, if you agree with Vera, if you have felt the same things that Vera described. So we have a question here from Rosie Delon, but I'm not sure I can actually understanding, maybe lacking a bit of punctuation. Is the public's view of an, oh sorry, no lack of punctuation. Is the public's view of uncertainty changing at all? Sorry, did you understand? This is the question from Rosie. Any one of you? Yes, Tracey, would you like to answer?
Thank you. Yeah, Rita, I'd love to. As I indicated in my opening remarks, I think we have seen a much more grown-up conversation about elements of uncertainty during the COVID crisis. And I suspect that that is what the discussion is about. I also think that going back to the debates that David is referring to, that there's a certain weariness now with this manufactured uncertainty, in the sense that we've seen that, we've been there before, you know, people, yes, we had the tobacco thing, and we had the kind of the oil industry, and it's almost like we've seen that paradigm, we know that pattern of behavior, and it's, for most people who don't have a lot of skin in the game, it's not really enough. And we can have a sense, that I find, we can have a sensible conversation. So there are people who are predisposed to a particular position, and they're not going to change their position around something like climate. But on the other hand, you know, you can have a sensible conversation about how much we need to know to make certain decisions. And as David said, to make the trade-offs with what we do. We could say that, you know, there's no guarantee when we jump out of a plane that the parachute's going to open, right? But if we've got to jump out of the plane, anyway, we still want that parachute. And, you know, and that's what the sort of discussion is that we often have to have, which is to say we have to take measures, regardless of waiting until, rather than not have any measures at all, and wait until we know everything. And as with COVID, I think people have really seen this, which is that there was not the possibility of waiting until we know even a fraction of what we'd like to know before taking measures to address it. And if you now think about how that might have shifted the paradigm, might have shifted the kind of narrative, it may be that we're seeing a bit of a turn away from that use of uncertainty that has plagued David's efforts to look after public health and environmental health. And it may be that we can have a better conversation now. Certainly, I think that's the experience, you know, Sense About Science, my charitable organisation, has been having, which is that people are aware that action needs to be taken before we know even, you know, the beginning of what we want to know. Now, just think about what that might mean for how we change the conversation about climate. I think that's quite exciting.
Okay. We have here two questions, but I would like to tie this with with just a little part of what David said, and to try to tie Tracey's answer, of course, with a part of what David said, and also a part of what Vera has said. So for a lot of people, this is something that is human. It is very difficult to deal with uncertainty in their daily lives. And I think that's why we don't like uncertainty in the news, because people don't like it, our audiences don't like it. How can journalists best explain the difference between common sense uncertainty and scientific uncertainty, if this is at all pertinent? And can psychologists, psychiatrists, emotional experts lend a hand here, or would this be too far-fetched?
No, I can speak from a regulatory point of view, and maybe we should really focus on this question of the COVID-19 virus and the vaccine, which has also come up in the chat box. The question that many of us are asking right now is, how do you motivate behavior change, both around protecting yourself and others from the virus, and also the vaccine? And there is obviously tremendous uncertainty. We don't know, we're learning more as we go. It's really interesting to watch. We sort of recognize now that certain activities that were suggested at the beginning people wiping down their groceries, for example, probably aren't really important at all. On the other hand, things that weren't suggested at the beginning, like opening your windows, are clearly understood to be much more important. So I think there has to be a real openness and transparency that this is a moving target, that we're just, that at least a lot of the people involved are honest. There's a lack of understanding, and differences also often comes from that sort of development. It's not wrong to tell people at the beginning that think about wiping down their groceries. I didn't do that because it made no sense to me, but I understand why people did that. But once we understand more, say, it looks much less likely, and the risk that you reduce by doing that is less. But right now, the pressing question is, what should we do about the vaccine? And I want to call people's attention to a really interesting meeting going on tomorrow. I'll put this in the chat box. I'm a member of the U.S. National Academies of Sciences panel that's trying to develop an equitable framework for allocating the vaccine. Who should get it first? Because the vaccine won't be available quickly. At best in January, we're thinking we'll have in the United States 10 million doses for a country of 300 million people. And then maybe a month or two later, we could have 20 or 30 million doses. Who should get that? And how do you convince people who should get it that they actually should go ahead and get it? Because there's a tremendous amount of hesitancy. And there isn't the research, and this really relates to the question. We don't have the social scientists or the psychologists who've done the research on behavior change to say how do people understand the messages that are being put out and how do they act on them? So tomorrow, it's from 12 to 5 US East Coast time. So it's in the afternoon, late afternoon and early evening in Europe. There's a public meeting where people will come and comment on this framework that we're actually, the proposal will come out in about half an hour, and then you have to comment on it tomorrow. So it's very fast track, obviously. But it's to think about these very issues. Like, there's a lot of uncertainty. We know that this vaccine is not going to be 100% effective. It may have some risks. What do we do with that information? And it will be a fascinating moment now to think about this, because there's tremendous mistrust in the United States right now about the vaccine. At the beginning of the pandemic, I joked that we're very fortunate that COVID-19 doesn't have a lobbyist, or we'd be seeing huge disputes over the science. And I was wrong. I mean, we are seeing disputes. Some of them are honest differences, but unfortunately, we're seeing, just as sort of corporate needs drive science, in the United States, we have a very polarized situation, and we have political needs driving decisions of agencies that are supposed to be protecting the public. To justify these decisions, science is being misrepresented or ignored, and which is so dangerous. I mean, it's bold, it's happening in front of our eyes in real time. The Centers for Disease Control, our lead public health agency, recognized there was a severe shortage of N95s, and so they held fast to the position that workers in nursing homes didn't need N95s. Well, I think what that does is that really makes our public health agencies much less trusted, and it's a huge problem. And we're having that over and over in the United States. I haven't been following so carefully in Europe, but it's going to be a big challenge to deal with, and people will trust the agencies charged with protecting them more. They'll trust them less, and they won't do what we recognize probably that they need to do.
Okay, thank you, David. I think you've also addressed Adriano's question. That's true. We had here another question from Daniela Ovadia. I think maybe for Vera, but of course, Tracey and David, you can jump in. And the question is, instead of focusing on the fact that the readers don't understand uncertainties, shouldn't we educate our editors, especially editors-in-chief and policymakers, to change their narrative of science?
I will take the chance to sum up all the questions that were being discussed here, because I think the audience, it is really the main focus for us, journalists, of course, the editors, like Daniela said, and people have to take these decisions every time, every day. They are faced with decisions, and then they are asked to trust in science and to trust in their physicians. But then they are sad that they are there's some uncertainty on the treatment they are given or the science behind it. So people, I'm sure that people feel afraid and they have to take a decision. For example, when they are faced with a treatment that has some uncertainty or some risk associated, they will have, together with the doctor, to take a decision. And there are some times when people don't want to take decisions. They want people to decide for.
You just froze, Vera.
Perhaps while, Rita, perhaps while we're waiting for Vera to rejoin us, I could just say something about this question of where we take this observation. I do think journalists need to be good at asking the question, does it matter? And assessing it. Because there are a lot of places where the uncertainty in the results basically, or the uncertainty in a forecast, basically means that you don't really have a forecast. So for example, if you have a situation as we had in the 2016 US election, where the uncertainty, it looked as though Hillary Clinton was going to win. If you look at the 538 website on this, it's really a beautiful picture. In fact, I'll share it with you because I think this is a great example of what we mean when we talk about the importance of understanding the uncertainty. So if you see this, it was widely reported that Hillary was going to win. But if you actually look at the range that was given, the confidence that we could have in that result, you'll see the huge overlap between both of those outcomes in the 2016 election. And to be fair, 538 put that across really clearly. Unfortunately, the journalists reporting it didn't put it across quite so clearly and announced, that it was a bit embarrassing, announcing that Hillary was going to win. So I think that there are other places too. I mean, we know that, Hurricane Charlie years ago, I'm using US examples for this European event. I didn't intend to do that, but Hurricane Charlie years ago led to massive improvements in the way that where a hurricane is going to make landfall or might make landfall is predicted. And instead of just looking at the track that the hurricane is following, what we have is that the probability is estimated on a whole range of different tracks that the hurricane can follow. And then what you end up is a much more accurate result. So I think we've now seen that drop from a sort of a range from 110 nautical miles to something like 65, which is a huge improvement in forecasting. So those kind of differences are really important. If you're a journalist reporting that a hurricane is going to make landfall, if you're a journalist reporting any kind of prediction, I think you need to know if a bank says that they are going to break even, but they've got plus or minus 1 billion in their range, they're either going to make a 1 billion profit or they're going to make a 1 billion loss. And those stories are equally possible, are also both possible. And as a reporter, you need to know what that margin possibility is. So I think those things are really important, that having that ability to unpack something is really important. But it's also important to ask, does it matter in the sense of, does it actually matter that there's uncertainty for the particular type of decision that we are going to take? Because I think we have to just accept that if you are reporting in most areas, you are going to be reporting on something that is on the unsettled end, for the most part. And you are going to be looking at subjects where there's all kinds of missing bits of information. But it may well be that for the decision that we need to take, we know enough. And so I do think that skill at unpacking things and looking at understanding, does uncertainty actually matter here? Or how much does it matter? Could it completely reverse my story? Or at the end of the day, is it not really pertinent to the decision that needs to be taken? I do think it would be useful also to know from journalists whether they're having trouble making those kinds of assessments, particularly when confronted with, the kind of modelling that we're seeing at the moment and so on.
Thank you, Tracey. I don't know if you want to finish, Vera.
Yes, please. I'm sorry for this. And I will just pick what Tracey was saying about hurricanes, because if you have some risk and you have a predicted risk where the hurricane may cross and people will for sure take measures to prevent themselves for being hit or to have a huge disaster. And so it is an uncertain science also. There's uncertainty and people will hear that and take measures. But related to climate change that Tracey was also referring, sometimes people just use the uncertainty to say, if they are not sure, I will not take actions. I will do nothing because they are not sure anyway. So people adjust the uncertainty or the settlement there is on science also to take to make their decisions to better suit their willing, of course. And one of the examples I would like to give you, and it's partially related to COVID, but it's also related to flu. And Northern Hemisphere will face a flu season while they are still dealing with COVID. And this is uncertain. Of course, people know that flu might be hit hard or not, or people might get sick or not. But flu vaccine, okay, it's not totally certain science, but it's well settled, or more, I would put it in a more settled extreme than unsettled. And still you have lots of health professionals that don't take the vaccine. So what message does this give to their patients? This is one. And then I will answer Daniela, or I will answer everyone. Yes, I really think that we should educate our editors because every time, and for example, using COVID now, because it's a really new topic, and you will have an expert that says that you will have, I don't know how many people dying in a brief notice because they model it, and in 1 month they will have a huge amount of people dying. Then other people say that in 1 month a few people will die, and you are always reporting on all this stuff. And because they are so-called experts and they are connected with a good university, and editors will jump in and want to report all of this. And I can think of also the Russian vaccine, that before they announced that they registered the vaccine, every week you had news saying half of the first clinical trial ended, now the full clinical, now the second one, and every week you would have news, but not real data. You had news. And of course, that is news, and editors will want to put it on their website somehow. So first we have to educate them, and also we have to make some context for our readers or for our audience, saying that, okay, they report this and they say this is the news, but we don't know, have the data to confirm that. They cannot say that it brings immunity because they haven't followed the and so on. So every time we have to put news in context, but editors won't let us go away from the news. If it is news, they will want to give it.
I want to follow up on, I think, a very important point that Vera made, this discussion about how you present information and what it means to people. You know, I'm a statistician, and you know, we talk all about 170,000 people in the United States now have died of COVID. That means nothing to people. It really is no different than 70,000, 170,000. You know, what does that mean to anyone? And I think you probably as reporters understand this better than us, but you know, when I teach statistics, I tell my students that, you know, statistics are people with the tears wiped away. And we need to remember that. We need to talk about the individual story. I always find that the people are much more, you could talk about statistics, but when you have to at the same time link it to individuals, because people aren't making that leap. You know, that's the social science or psychological question we talked about before. If you want people to really understand what it means to have, you know, a nursing home filled with old people where, you know, 80% of them have died, that doesn't mean anything. But when you start talking about the individuals, that has to be part of all of your stories. I think that you just, even if you do a great job presenting the science and the uncertainty, you can't forget it's about people and to include them as well, because that's what people remember when you tell them, when they've read your article and they think about what you're trying to say. Only with that link will it actually have an impact on them. And they will appreciate your work that much more if you do that, I think.
Okay, thank you, David. I'd just like to remind everybody at this time that we have less than 20 minutes until the end of our session. Time flies by. So I'm just trying to keep track of the questions here at the chat box. And so Kan Hoang, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, asks, imagine that reporters had reported something which is uncertain and that piece of information after a while was proved to be wrong. In that case, how can you deal with the responses? Could be the anger, frustration, being upset, disappointed from the audiences, and how can you calm them down and gain their trust back? Any tips for the reporters can be applied? I think actually our three speakers have already talked a little bit about this, but still, if you have something more to add as concrete tips to help Kan Hoang and the rest of the audience.
Well, perhaps one of the things we could say is that it doesn't take much imagine to see this scenario, because this is what happens all the time. And sometimes it happens just because knowledge is scant, and sometimes it happens because people get exciting sounding press releases. But I mean, I'll give you an example where I think there's quite a lot of culpability is in Fukushima. Where the earthquake and the tsunami caused thousands of deaths, and people were struggling with a complete wipeout in their society. But all of the European press wanted to write about a nuclear disaster that didn't actually happen as it happens, which is quite amazing given the poor state of the infrastructure right on the coast there. But strangely didn't happen. And it seemed it wasn't just the journalists, European politicians wanted to talk about that too, rather than the huge displacement of people that was taking place and the awful losses that were going on there. And I find it amazing that such a devastating experience a human experience could happen. And all that anybody wanted to talk about was this much more exotic sounding story of this impending nuclear disaster. So I think that was terrible. I actually think that people who did that should have lost a lot more trust of their readers for doing so. And I think that there is a culpability there that has never been addressed. So it does happen. Obviously, the things that we're talking about, sharing with people the nature of knowledge is an important part of the story, and I think helps you if you're reporting something that is that you don't feel sure about, or that, I understand, journalists don't always get to specialize. Sometimes you are reporting 1 minute on some celebrity's new diet program, and then you're reporting the next minute on COP25, and sometimes you're actually reporting right across a wider spectrum of news stories as a generalist. So I understand that, but I think if you can share some of the nature of knowledge, we call it knowledge know-how at Sense About Science in our interactions with the public, and I think if you can share some of that, I think then you've come to that story as an honest broker. And you've reported the best you can under the circumstances.
If I can add to that, I think Tracey raised a really interesting example that I wasn't aware of. But I follow these issues, at least in the United States, carefully, because I was, as I said, the chief safety officer for the nuclear weapons complex, so very much involved in these radiation issues. And there are issues like radiation, which some people, they're almost like religion. There are people out there who believe that any amount of radiation is dangerous. And there are people out there who believe that no amount of radiation is dangerous except the most extreme amounts. The zealotry in radiation is huge. It's also true in other areas as well, but particularly about radiation. And this is something that you all really have to watch for. that there are people who will, whatever the data is, they will look at it and find, whatever they believe in advance. And it makes, it's tougher for journalists to find the scientific experts you can trust. But it really, there are a couple of areas like that, and radiation certainly is one of them, where people have staked out positions and they will hold those positions no matter what. And in this case, clearly, missed, the forest for the twigs. In some case, I mean, there's still radiation in Fukushima. It's still a very significant issue up there, but that was a disaster. That tsunami was, horrifying, and was just had a huge impact on people's lives. So it's again another challenge for all of you. I mean, it's not easy because you're reporting on these legitimate differences, these non-legitimate differences, and they're complicated. And your job is to get that to the general public. And I admire you for trying to do it right.
Thank you, David. There was actually another question here directly.
Can I also answer this?
Sorry, Vera. Of course. You have the floor.
I think we as journalists, we have to be humble and honest. This is and transparent, of course. Humble when we speak with our sources, with the experts. Humble to realize that we don't know everything. We want them to tell us stuff, and humble with our audience. If we don't have all the information, be humble and honest about it. This is one thing. And if we have uncertainty, we should report uncertainty, of course, and risk, and the settlement of science, like Tracey was saying. But it's not always easy, and it might happen that we look so certain about something, like I would say our Director General, Health Director General was saying no use of masks, and 1 week later, use masks. And of course, first we were reporting no use masks, and then we were reporting use masks. And it wasn't our fault, but it could happen that it was a journalist's fault. So what we have to do first, we have to avoid as much as possible, be certain about something when there's no certainty, but it might happen that if a health official is saying that, we will trust it. Then you have to say, okay, maybe they were wrong or we were wrong. Usually journalists are pointed out like we are always wrong about everything. We just have to say, okay, we were wrong, and now we will correct the information. And if we play like that, if we show our readers or audience that we assume our mistake and we correct that mistake to provide the correct information, I think that is very important, and that will engage our readers. And about the people that might be angry or frustrated, I will just ask my colleagues to be aware of bullies. There are lots of bullies on social media or on even our websites. I can see every time I write an article.
Vera? Well, Vera froze again. Maybe I will go to David. We have a question specifically for David. And if you feel you already answered, it's okay. And I'd like to add something. So Sruti SB asks David, uncertainty when coupled with urgency can often result in unfounded panic. How do you recommend that we balance our communication to convey both without inciting panic? And then I would also like to add my question, if it has a quick answer, is that how can journalists detect fabricated uncertainty and convey it?
Those are both great questions. Certainly, the urgency is, it's a little bit in the mind of the beholder. I would say we have huge urgency around climate change that we're not really addressing because it's so hard to do anything about it. But you know, it's probably worthwhile finding respected sources to convey that, you know, the idea that this is important, but you don't need to, you know, change your life tomorrow. That this is it's worthwhile to avoid certain things or to take the vaccine or things like that, but in a way that's sort of reassuring. And of course, this is really, it should be the role of the government as well to say this is really, these are the steps you should be taking. It's tough as a journalist to do that if you're not getting the leadership from your government to do that, or from the public health community. Finding the manufacturer uncertainty is tough, but I think you have to look at really the provenance of where studies are coming from. Who's, obviously you ask who pays for them, but also the people who did them and what's their history. You can't be expected to be able to read a study and figure out, you know, how the results were shaped. As I said, I can only do it for some, and not everybody can do it, and certainly the public can't. And I often get asked by people when I'm talk about my book, for example, how do I know what chemicals are safe? And I tell people, you know, that's not your job. You shouldn't have to look at the side of a shampoo bottle and decide which of these chemicals are okay and which ones aren't. You can't figure that out. It's a social problem, not an individual problem. It's like saying, you know, the bridges in my community are falling apart. What can I do about them? You can't do anything about them other than to make sure you have a government that takes care of you, that does those things, because it can't fall on the individual. So in some ways, your writing should say not just what the issue is, but which government agency should be addressing this, and are they or are they not doing that? Because they're the ones in many cases who really have to take those steps to protect people.
Rita, can I pick up on that? Because I think that's a really, really important point. And I do think journalists have sometimes been complicit in making scientists the arbiters of social action. Climate's one example, but you know, so often governments would like to park their difficult, polarized issues with the science and imagine that somehow this is going to get resolved in some sort of a consensus building exercise between two parties at war. And then it's kind of come back to me when you're finished. And actually that is not the role of science. And in fact, science should be pulling each other, you know, scientists should be pulling each other apart. We don't want to squash out minority opinions or awkward questions because we'll end up with bad science. But that's not the same thing. And scientists should not be the arbiters of these big questions. What we're missing so often is the leadership and the decision making that's needed. And if journalists would turn their fire a little bit more on that, rather than keep looking around in the science, because to be honest, first of all, with the manufactured side of things, we create this kind of fake bar for certainty that no one's ever going to get past. And even if they did, the reality is that the people who have dug in on the opposite side are going to stay dug in on the opposite side, because it's never a scientific issue for them anyway. It's a decision of policy or priorities, whose interests are being served. Those things need to be pulled apart and discussed and decided in a social and political setting. And all the science stuff is a sideshow to that. And we end up politicizing that science. We end up with those situations in climate that we saw where people sometimes don't feel comfortable talking about the uncertainties in their models and so on, because they know that they will get abused and turned into something of a bigger deal than they are, or used as a way of holding up a decision on climate change remediation policies. But so that's what I think we want to try and do here, is avoid over politicizing the science. And when we spot this process, and if journalists spot this practice of politicians trying to shunt things into a scientific debate, I mean, the worst example of it perhaps is the abortion debate in the States, where it's so clearly not a scientific discussion, and yet somehow we end up in these rows about the viability of a 23-year-old fetus, 23-week-old fetus, which it really isn't going to be decided around that. So I think we should resist it as a population. I think we should, that's voting for people to make decisions. And I think we should certainly resist it as journalists reporting those stories.
Thank you very much, Tracey. We have less than 5 minutes to go, so I'm terribly sorry. I'll just pass on something that Daniela Ovadia asked me to tell all the participants, is to remind you that the conference will end at 6:15 p.m. Central European time, with the award ceremony of the European Science Journalist of the Year and the closing remarks. But to attend, you have to leave this Zoom room and to enter the link for track 1 Zoom sessions.
And I just put, I'm sorry to jump in. Thank you very much, Rita. Thank you to all the speakers. I just put the link directly in the question and answer in the chat, so you can easily click on it. And so thank you very much again for the interesting exchange. And I hope you had the opportunity to express all your points. And I hope you will stay with us for some few more minutes for the 2 awards for the European Science Journalist of the Year and for the Climate Grant, which is also a very important moment for us journalists. I see that there are several links that are being shared here. So before leaving, copy and paste all these links that Rita or Vera, I don't remember.
It was me, but I would call your attention to David Michael's previous link at nationalacademies.org. It's something that's going to happen tomorrow, and it's very interesting for some questions and discussion that took place here in this session.
Yes, and we will make all these links available also with the video, which will be soon available as well. So thanks again, and see you on the other channel. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our speakers and to all the participants. And thank you also, Fabio.
Thank you very much.